Hello. In this segment of The Art of Thinking, we will discuss what are called the classical principles of thought. In the last segment, we looked at worldview, and we understood that these are basic ideas and beliefs that people have that they look out at the world through. And these, if you will, are the lenses through which we interpret our world. The principles, the classical principles of thought are understood to be guides of reason. The assertion is not that if we understand these principles and apply them, they will tell us what is right and what is wrong. They won't. They will guide our thinking as we examine evidence and arguments as we reach toward understanding what is right and what is wrong. The first of these principles is the principle of identity. It tells us that everything is something in particular. If everything is something in particular, then everything is what it is and it's not what it's not. It's one thing and it's not all the other things it's not. So, a tree is a tree. It is not a stream. It is not a stone. It is not a bird. And a stream is not a tree or a stone or a bird, and on it goes. You understand? Everything is something in particular. Now, this is important to thinking, and because it's important to thinking, it's important to conversation. We can understand things as they are because we understand that everything is something in particular. And as we come better to understand something as it is, we develop a concept of it in our minds. But in order for human beings to reason one mind to another, we have to have words that communicate the concepts. And so the words communicate concepts which understand a thing as it is in itself because everything is something in particular. And this is why conversation is possible. When two people enter into a conversation, you have two minds trading concepts. And if that conversation is going to be fruitful and productive for the people involved in it, they have to understand that they want correct concepts of things so that they can communicate accurately and correctly with one another. Now, you might ask, how do you know that your concepts of things are correct? This comes to the principle of the excluded middle. The principle of the excluded middle says, for any understanding of something, for any claim, either it's true or its contrary is true. As we study and learn things, we must keep in mind, and this is what the principle of the excluded middle does for us. It helps us to bear in mind that as I reason through something, I could be wrong. I could be wrong in part. I could be wrong in whole. But it's almost certain in most things, maybe we could exclude the truths of mathematics, then in most things, we cannot know for certain if we're right. This is one of the reasons why conversation is so important, because in conversation, among the things you can do is separate out from our analysis of something what is highly unlikely to be true on the grounds of reason. But we also can reach closer and closer to what is true by coming ever clearer to understand things, because our concepts are clarifying, because we understand that everything is something in particular, and our reasoning, interpreting of these concepts and what they mean is clarifying, because we understand that from the principle of the excluded middle that it's possible we could be wrong. But as we learn more, we realize that that range of possibility in which we could be wrong is shrinking. It may not shrink to zero so that we have certainty, but it can definitely shrink to the place where we have high confidence. And that's certainly one place we want to go when we talk about what it means to know something. The third principle is the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction says two halves of a contradiction cannot both be true at the same time. If someone says this piece of paper is white and it's black, that's a contradiction. It's either the one or some other. But this, we know for certain that this is false. If I say today is Monday in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and not Monday in Jacksonville, North Carolina, my statement is false. Because the only way for it to be Monday in North Carolina is if the statement that it's not Monday in Jacksonville, North Carolina is false. Right? So in the principle, when applying the principle of contradiction, if we're reasoning through something, and we come to a contradiction, we know we have made a mistake. This is the way in which the principle of non-contradiction can guide our thinking. The principle of non-contradiction, when you encounter a contradiction, doesn't tell you which part of the contradiction is true. And it's possible that in a contradiction, both parts of it are false. But this we know for certain, at least one of the halves of the contradiction is false, because it can only be true if the other one is false. One of them is clearly false. Again, this is to be distinguished from the principle of the excluded middle, which simply says for any kind of claim or statement we can make about something, either what we said is true or some contrary interpretation of that statement is true. So in a sense, we could say that the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction guide our thinking, one, by keeping in our minds that everything is something in particular, that they don't wander around into different kinds of things. And the other saying that if you have a claim of the form, this is schematic, but of the form A and not A, you're holding them both together. This thing is an A and it's not an A. That's a contradiction. That statement is false. And the principle of the excluded middle asks us to keep in mind that we could be wrong in part or in whole in anything. And this is why it is so important to engage honestly with other people in contradiction so that we can start sifting through these things and setting aside what is more likely to be false than something else, narrowing the candidates for true interpretations of things. This is very important. But it's also important to bear in mind that these principles are guides. They're not computers. They don't take in data and then give us an answer. They simply guide our own thinking. And it's looking at how we think in argumentation, which will be the subject of our next segment, where we consider propositions and arguments.